The Handkerchief by Great 78.
Chapter 111. Separations. Draco apparated onto the dirt path outside of his aunt's house, and a moment later the house had ballooned into existence. He took the steps 2 at a time and then stood at the door awkwardly, hand poised to knock. What was he going to say? The door opened before he could decide. Tonks, heavily pregnant, stood looking at him with bleary, bloodshot eyes and red-stained cheeks. Her hair, usually a vibrant pink, now lay against her shoulders, the sleek black curls of her mother's hair. "You've heard something else?" Tonks asked, almost as though she could tell. Draco nodded without speaking, and the two cousins walked into the living room. Theo got another message on the coin. It was from Dean Thomas. He was the Hogwarts student traveling with them. Ted, Dirk, and one of the goblins was killed. There was a collective gasp from the 3 women in the room. Draco heard a noise behind him and turned to see Remus Lupin entering the kitchen, tea tray laden with a teapot, cups, and saucers. Lupin locked eyes with him. Draco could tell that he had overheard everything. Draco continued, his voice ragged. "He and the other goblin just got away. He said that Ted forbade him to come out of their hiding spot, and that as soon as possible he needed to apparate away. Ted disillusioned Dean and then ran out into the skirmish. Dean said he did something, some kind of ward-adjusting magic that allowed a drop in the anti-apparition enchantments for just a few seconds. Dean grabbed the goblin he was hiding with and disapparated." Draco lowered his head and took a deep breath. No one spoke. "Dean and the goblin went back the next morning, once it was daybreak. They found Ted's coin. Ted and Dirk and the other goblin were still there. At this, Draco paused and pushed hard against the lump in his throat, remembering the savagery that Theo had relayed to him. He would not tell them all of the details. Best to keep that to himself. Ted, at least, had not been messed with. He continued. He dug them each a grave using magic, and enchanted a small boulder red so that they can be found again when—" But at this, horrifically, Draco could not continue. It was all too much. It was all too much. The horror of it all, everything, swept over him. Dumbledore, Diggory, Willingham, even Lopi and the Father Bird, and now Ted and the others. The dead, the hurt, Harper, Montague, Katie Bell, fucking Weasley, and one of his brothers, Ollivander and Luna in the cellars, Richard Granger with that pained look in his eye. When was it all going to end? Silently, Lupin put down the tray and put a hand upon his shoulder. Draco turned to him, hating himself for his weakness, and cried against the man's shirt, as Lupin's arm encircled his heaving shoulders. After a few minutes he gathered himself enough to withdraw his handkerchief and wipe his tears. "I'm sorry," he said to the room at large, not intending for his emotions to overtake him. But as he looked around he realized that he was not alone in his emotions. His mother rubbed her sister's back as tears streamed down her own face. Andromeda and Tonks gripped each other close in a hug, and Lupin likewise brushed away tears. Everyone gathered themselves enough to sit down for tea. Narcissa began to pour and pass the cups, whilst Lupin added sugar, milk, or honey to his wife's and mother-in-law's likings. "Ah, I've forgotten the biscuits," Lupin said. "Shall I call—" But before Tonks or Andromeda could answer, Draco cut in. "Allow me to fetch them." He needed a bit of a break from the others after his breakdown before. The door to the kitchen swung open, then settled shut behind him as he stepped through. There was a Pop next to him, and a small house elf wearing a yellow dress smiled up at him. He did not know her, but she looked rather familiar. You must be Raffi, Draco said. I must be, the elf smiled, and that hair must make you Draco. Draco stood a bit dazed for a moment. Something was very different about this interaction. He had never had this kind of conversation with any other house elf, but he could not put his finger on why. I came for the biscuits, he finally said, in a confused tone. He noticed the small plate on the center of the table in the room, and made as if to go to it. You didn't need to trouble yourself. I could have brought them to you, Raffi said, and once again, something seemed different. You? Draco asked. I? The elf asked back, amused by his behavior. And then it clicked. The elf referred to herself as I. Such a simple thing, a pronoun, and yet the distinction was so great. Raffi, can I ask you a question about the way you talk? Draco began cautiously. Of course, Draco. That was again the difference. Not Master, or Master Draco, or Master Malfoy. Just Draco. He recalled how difficult that had been for Dobby, and yet this elf called him Draco without compunction. When did you start using the word I to describe yourself? The small elf seemed to consider as she busied herself cleaning the already immaculate countertop. I think it was a bit after I went to Hogwarts. I was still quite young, only about 18 or so. I was newly freed, which was meant to be shameful. The elf thought for a moment. I was very ashamed. I felt embarrassed and lonely. I didn't know any of these other elves, and although they were very kind, almost none of them had had clothes given to them. Raffi snapped her fingers, and the plate of biscuits disappeared, likely appearing on the table out in the living room for the others. She raised her thin, tiny hand, and a tin of biscuits floated down from a nearby shelf for the two of them to share. 2 small cups of tea appeared. Draco sat across from her to hear her story. There was a teacher there. She was very kind. She was young, only in her 40s, but she had experienced heartbreak, and she understood how I felt. This teacher had fallen in love with a muggle, but she knew that if she married him, she would no longer be herself. She would need to lock away her wand, suppress her magic. She would lead a life of lies, and it wasn't a life she wanted for herself. She was like my Andromeda that way. Andry didn't want the life her parents expected for her, either. Draco nodded. It was not always easy, loving someone so different from yourself. After she left her muggle, this teacher came to Hogwarts alone. For years, even though she was happy with the choice she made, she was lonely. She had given up love and had chosen magic over her own happiness. Raffi looked out of the window in contemplation and continued. But in time she came to realize that she had a greater calling than love. She threw herself into her work, and though she was heartbroken, she healed herself and became stronger for it. She valued herself and her own inner strength, and she taught that to me. She told me that I should refer to myself as I, because I have value. I can contribute something to the world, even though I don't have a home to keep and a family to serve. So I did. At this the elf smiled. I worked my way up to the head elf in the kitchens at Hogwarts. I married another free elf, Juno. He works here now as well. And we have our daughter, Folly. She is working towards becoming the head elf someday, too. Raffi, when was the last time you saw your father? Draco asked suddenly. He was a bit afraid of the answer she was about to give. The tiny elf looked at him in confusion. Papa? I haven't seen him since I was given clothes. He worked in the stables for Master Cygnus, although Andromeda says that Cygnus is dead now. Folly has said that she's gotten sweets from Papa on her birthday in recent years, but she doesn't know where he is." The elf looked at him hopefully. "Why? Do you know where my papa is, Draco?" "Pym." He spoke the word into the space around him, and yet somehow his elf's magic knew, and Pym came to him. Years before, Pym had been tied to Cygnus, who likely cared little about elfin family ties. Then Narcissa, who had not known where Raffi was for many, many years. As Pym's current master, Draco alone could call him and know that he'd have to come instantly. Although facilitating this meeting gave him great happiness, the understanding that these elves didn't have the freedom to make it happen on their own was so sad, a bit crushing to him. If Hermione had asked him right now to fund an entire SPEW campaign, not only would he have gladly done it, he'd have created the brochure. Draco stood back, watching the little family reunion with a small smile on his face. He'd done this, in spite of how badly the day had started, with such heartache. Some good had come of it. He turned to go. "Thank you, Draco," Raffi called to him. "You're welcome, Raffi. Thank you for the talk." He paused with his hand on the door. "Wait, Raffi, you never finished the story. What happened with the teacher, the one who gave up love for magic?" "She still teaches transfigurations at Hogwarts," Raffi said simply. The two elves turned back to each other, focused on catching up, not noticing the stunned expression on Draco's face. It was McGonagall, the young witch that gave up love, but went on to inspire this elf. That afternoon, back in his suite, Draco reflected on what he'd learned about McGonagall. She had devoted her life to helping others, it seemed. Teaching, offering words of kindness and strength to a lonely elf, supporting the Order. It was a life well lived, he was sure. A better life by far than many. One he himself would be proud to live. But he could not give up on his love for Hermione. His body, his soul, no, his very magic wouldn't allow it. He took out the handkerchief and spoke the password. "How are you doing?"
"Much the same, I suppose. We don't know where we're going. We don't know what we're looking for. We have a sword, but nothing to destroy. Harry is still distracted. He's still thinking about these Hallows. Ron is trying to keep him focused on the search, but he doesn't have any good ideas either. And he keeps trying to tune into a show on the wireless at all hours of the evening. The static is driving me up the wall. Sometimes I just want to blast that thing into smithereens." Draco chuckled a bit. She had said this before. Ever since the weasel had come back, he'd been talking about all the things he'd heard whilst on the run from snatchers. Draco was glad that Weasley was back with them. Even if he didn't care for the bloke, he knew that Hermione did, and it had been a hardship for them without him. "Keep your head up. Have you tried the Conwy Valley in Wales? That's where Helga Hufflepuff was supposedly from. Perhaps the cup is there." "We tried it. The castle that was built on the site of an old ruin a couple of 100 years ago has just been purchased and it's undergoing renovations. We tried to poke about, but it was difficult during the day with the workers there," she continued. "Besides, Harry thinks the items are hidden in places that were significant to you-know-who, or with significant people. The ring was within his ancestral home. The locket was in a cave that he, well, suffice to say, it was significant to him. And he left the diary with one of his most trusted allies. We've been everywhere we can think of."
"It will happen, Mai." Once again, Draco was glad that the handkerchief could not reveal tone. He said that both encouragingly and with dread. If this prophecy were real, it was all coming a lot sooner than they thought. He wanted to tell her about the prophecy, but what if telling her caused her to make the wrong move? Guessing at the meaning behind a prophecy was what had caused Potter to be chosen by the Dark Lord in the first place. No. Potter had a plan, and Hermione was his best bet for making this plan come to fruition. Better to let them figure this out. He could not bring himself to tell her about Ted. It wouldn't change anything for her, and it would only upset her. She had enough bad news to be getting on with. Dinner that night was a new level of the special blend of disgusting and terrifying that Draco had come to expect from meals with Bellatrix. Several snatchers showed up with a severed goblin's head, a human hand, and a wand as proof of a recent kill. They asked Bellatrix for bounty money, claiming that the goblin and the wizard from whom the hand had come were 2 of the 5 that had been killed, a mix of goblins and wizards. Having heard what the snatchers had done to Dirk and the goblin, Draco thought he might be sick right there on the table. "Where are the other heads?" Bellatrix asked, eyeing the shriveled head in front of them on the table, dropped unceremoniously in the center of the table just as the French onion soup was being served. Lucius exhaled fiercely through his nose. Narcissa focused on the wallpaper attached to the wall opposite her, her body as stiff as wax. Draco watched the flickering lights in the fixture above their heads, and took inventory in the potions cupboards of his mind. Rue, brewed nettles, arnica oil, hippogriff feather. "Get this out of my house, and don't come back without living things!" Lucius roared suddenly. Narcissa jerked and made a squeaking noise. Draco spilled the arnica oil he'd been pouring into another vial in his mind. "Why the fuck do you think I want my dinner interrupted this way? And why would we pay you for dead things? How is this creature supposed to give us information or leverage when it's dead?" Lucius raged. The snaggletooth snatcher took up the head by the hair. A bit of something fell off into Draco's soup. "Rue! Nettles!" his mind screamed. Finally, thankfully, they were gone. Bellatrix swept off without a word to anyone. They could hear her charging flat-footed up the main staircase to the guest suite that she'd taken over. Narcissa cast a muffliato that fell over them like a heavy blanket. "Draco, are you all right?" He looked at her in terrified disbelief. "No! Are you?" "No," she said quietly. Then she looked up at Lucius, a look of quiet understanding passing between them that Draco only just caught. "Thank you." Draco let out a huff that came out more like a silent scream. "Why are you thanking him? He's allowing these people into our house." Lucius gave him a cold stare, looking at him appraisingly for several seconds before speaking slowly and quietly. "That is true. It's all a result of a decision I made many years ago." The older man rubbed at his forearm gravely. "I am not a better person now, but I see now that I could have made better decisions." Draco stared at him in disbelief. It was the closest that he imagined his father might ever come to an apology. Lucius continued. "As you know, there are many individuals out there who are seeking, shall we say, bigger targets. Targets with more value than a couple of goblins and some no-name wizards. If those targets are acquired, I assume you would agree that you would rather their heads not be parted from their bodies, correct?" Draco gasped involuntarily. I would take that as a yes."
Lucius stood and walked as quickly from the room as his limping gait would allow. "He has not been the same man since he returned from Azkaban. I think he thought that you would never have to... well, he thought by making himself important in the ranks, he could prevent you from needing to become involved. Keep you from having to..." Narcissa gestured to her left forearm vaguely.
"It didn't work out that way," Draco said through clenched teeth, running his fingers along the robe sleeve that covered his ugly dark mark.
"No, it didn't. I believe he regrets it." Narcissa spoke quietly, her lips barely moving, reminding him of Blaise all those years ago, in the stands next to the Black Lake, during the second task of the Triwizard Tournament.
"He isn't alone in that regret." "No, he isn't."
Draco stood and moved to the door, feeling the muffliato fall away as he exited. He had been so looking forward to the French onion soup as soon as he'd smelled it. It had always been one of his favorites. Now, he didn't know if he could ever eat it again. He heaved a sigh. If he only focused on the loss of the soup, perhaps he would not need to think of anything else tonight. Thank you for listening to this chapter of The Handkerchief by Great 78.